Hi Year 12, so I'm going to go over today with you the points and the factors that I've given you to look at for the next piece of homework that you've got for me. So I thought I'd do it this way, so it's almost like a lesson, and I'm going to talk you through the points of the different types of power change that we can see from kind of the 1800s onwards, just so you get a little bit more, hopefully a little bit more information about it, and you're not as stuck as you might be if you're just trying to do it by yourself. So the first thing I want to consider is, from last lesson, what is hard and what is soft power, because the basis of this unit about power is about countries influencing other countries, and the main way that countries influence other countries is through two ways, and that's hard power and soft power. Now, hard power is generally what we would say as military power. So hopefully you've been looking at those countries that we've been looking at, the US and Brazil, India, China, the EU, etc., in terms of their military capabilities. So obviously having a military means that you can have control over countries if you need to. You can put armies in there, you can put tanks in there, you can put a military present within that country, and you can control it. So in the past, in the 1800s up to the middle of the 1900s, I suppose, hard power was very much the way that countries controlled other countries. They control them with their armies and with their forces within that other country, and so they were controlled in that way. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail when we look at the British Empire. Hard power also could be things like economic sanctions, allowing or not allowing certain countries to have investments and things like that. So economic power is somewhere between hard and soft, but sometimes it's erring on the side of hard in this case. And like I said, economic sanctions and things like that will be considered harder power, because you're imposing your economic regulations on another country. So a lack of free trade, you could argue, is hard power, because you're not allowing that country to trade. So where the WTO is trying to stop trade barriers and taxes and tariffs, etc., countries that continue with that could be, you could suggest that was hard power as well, because you are controlling that country's economy, you're not allowing that country to trade. When we move into soft power, economic power could be soft power as well. The sun's just gone in. So economic power could also be considered somewhat soft power. So TNCs locating within countries, the global shift of TNCs from the west to the east, we could suggest that is softer power, because the countries are investing there, and they're helping, I suppose, those countries develop more economically, especially in the case of maybe China and India. And then the other real big type of soft power we have is culture. So cultural power is very, very, very important, and some would argue it's the most important factor in maintaining power. So that will be things like the media, music, TV, cable TV, all at Sky, all that kind of stuff. That would all be suggested to be soft power, and therefore very, very influential. Language acquisition and that kind of thing about the US having English and stuff like that, that's kind of soft power. Most music and most TV that's very popular is in English, etc. So that is what we would call soft power or cultural power. So that is hard and soft power. So I just thought I'd go over that with you before we start the next little bit. Right, so the next topic area that we've got within superpowers is this idea of power shift over time. And I'm just going to talk you through some of the things that I've given you PowerPoints on, in case you're a little bit confused or you don't really, there's a lot to read through. But like I said in the email, I would suggest that you read all the stuff first. I would just read the PowerPoint. I would read the section from the book. I'd read about the first 10 pages, to be quite honest. So just give them a read. Just get your head round the idea of shift of power and how that power shift has happened over time. And that will give you a really good background for continuing with the topic, because the initial bit of the topic is a little bit overwhelming, and then once we've got those fundamentals, it actually becomes a lot clearer and a lot easier, really. But it is quite geopolitical, so it's it's worthwhile on the area through the High-Step portal. It might be an idea to have a look at that stuff that we've put on about enrichment, because I put superpowers on there for that purpose. So we're on the second part of that. I set you the first one for homework last time. So on the second part, so it would really be worth you checking out a few of those videos and watching a couple of those Vox videos, etc., to get your head around what we're doing. So let's start first of all with the British Empire. So that was about the 1800s, 1800s, and you've probably heard of the British Empire, hopefully you have. It's when the UK and Great Britain kind of went abroad and we took over. We do this a little bit in year 11 and we've done it a little bit last year as well. We kind of took over lots and lots of places, mostly for the UK, you know, anywhere that's got the Commonwealth. You've heard of the Commonwealth Games. So all of those countries, we went into those countries and we took that land and we took the resources from those areas. So that was the British Empire. It was more of a multipolar world, I suppose, then. The British Empire was the strongest of all the empires. The French had an empire, the Spanish had an empire. But the British Empire was by far the biggest. But there were still other countries within Europe that were moving into other parts of the world. Now, the reason we can see that today is that any other part of the world that's got English or French or Spanish or Portuguese as the main language, then it shows which of those countries kind of colonised. So India was a big one for us, and parts of Africa we took over, and their kind of second language is English. You have South America, which is predominantly Spanish, so obviously they weren't speaking Spanish before the conquistadors kind of got there and that kind of thing. You've got Brazil, which is Portuguese, so the Portuguese settlers went over there. You've obviously got America, speaking English, so the Europeans went over there into Canada, etc., and Australia. Any of the countries now that got the flag, our flag on their flag, is a good sign that it's the British Empire. On the sheets, the worksheet that you've got a list of countries, and that's easy to find on the internet as well. So what did we do? Well, we travelled to those colonies, and the king at the time, it's on the PowerPoint that you've got. I'm not a history teacher, but the person on the throne at the time kind of gave his consent. It's called mercantilism. Any of you that do history, and mercantilism means that the monarchy give their permission for those troops. Mostly they were troops anyway, to go abroad and take what they wanted, and they gave them the green light, as it were, from a political point of view, to go and do that, because it expanded the amount of land and the amount of area that we were in control of, and that was power. Obviously, power was about influence over people, and we were heavily influential at that point. So we took their land, we grew crops on it, we took the resources, we took natural resources, we used the indigenous people as labour, etc. And that was to gain power, okay? So we took religion to these countries, we took Catholicism or Christianity, we took language, etc. And we took the resources from them, we brought them back to the UK. So it was about economic growth, and it was about economic power as well. So whilst we were doing that in certain parts of the world, the French were doing it, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch obviously went to South Africa, etc. So we see all of this now with languages and flags and things like that. So that was the British Empire, and they were the empire years, and that went on for a couple of hundred years. And it went on through the 1800s into the 1900s. And although obviously from an ethical point of view it wasn't great, that's the way that things were then. And so, there was very... those countries, because you might be sitting at home thinking, well, how could they do that? Well, we had guns, we had firepower, we had ammunition, we had gunpowder. So we went to those places and they didn't. So we took things by force, and that's what happens. And if you go to the British Museum today, you will see relics from all over the world that we took. We've got the Elgin marbles in the downstairs rooms. As you go into the British Museum and you turn left, we've got the Elgin marbles, which we took from Greece and we still haven't given back. We've got all kinds of relics and all kinds of expensive things that we took from those countries, and we put them in museums because we think, oh, we need to preserve them, etc. So that's all historically all comes from that idea of colonialism, which is about you putting your people into a place that doesn't belong to you, essentially. So from an ethical point of view, it wasn't our best time, but it was, Great Britain. That's kind of where, the British Empire, that kind of thing, that kind of idea of power came from. So essentially, that kind of all came to an end at the end of the Second World War. So as you know, we had the Great War, and that cost kind of a lot of money. It cost a lot of money, countries a lot of money, because they had to pay for soldiers, they had to pay for ammunitions, etc., etc. And then when the Second World War came about, in the late 30s into the 40s, It took a lot of money from the UK, and it took a lot of money from Europe, because to fight against the Nazis, we had to put troops on the ground. We had to send all the men abroad. The women were in manufacturing and working in factories, etc., trying to keep the economy going, etc. And we spent lots and lots and lots and lots of money on that. So at the end of the Second World War, 1945, Europe was in a really, really bad place economically, because it kind of been ruined by the fact that we'd had this war. So what happened was then several things kind of came into play to kind of disband the empire for us and for the other European countries. So overall, Europe had no money left. So if you think about it, you can't control a place if you've got no troops on the ground. So there wasn't the money to pay for those troops, to pay their wages, to pay for the ammunition, etc. So we started to lose power in that way, because we couldn't keep the troops there. We had to get the economy back on its feet, and we, a bit like now really, when coronavirus goes, whenever it does, but we'll talk about that later. And it was about the UK having to spend money to bring its economy back online, because it had 5, 6, 7, however, 6 years of the Second World War. And spending all that money. So we had to spend money on our own economy. So we lost a lot of those troops abroad. So it's hard to maintain power if you don't have troops on the ground. Also, ethically, we just had the Second World War, and we'd had the Nazis who'd obviously tried that ethical cleansing of the Jewish community and the Jewish people. So from an ethical point of view and from a moral point of view, it didn't seem right, and a lot of people were saying, look, you can't do this, you can't control these people, these lands don't belong to you. So there's a bit of a backlash, as it were, from a moral point of view and an ethical point of view, to give those colonies back, to who they rightfully belong to the people who live there. And there was a lot of pressure, from human rights groups and other political parties and that, to stop this. And also the countries themselves, because the military presence became a lot less, they were able to kind of take a bit more of a forward step to try and get the troops out. So, a lot of things played at the same time to disband the British Empire, and that's when it started to crumble, and we had to start slowly giving these countries back. And from my point of view, the age that I am, I remember in the late 80s, I think it was early 1990 it might have been, that we had to give Hong Kong back to the Chinese, because that was a UK province as well, part of the empire, and we had to give that back. So that was how the British Empire rose, because of mercantilism and because of the fact that we had a good climate. We were able to grow crops, so we could feed our people. We had lots of woodland and a good climate and stuff like that. So we were able to, when that happens and you're able to feed your people, it's easy for technological and medical innovations to happen, because people are healthy enough to do it. So that's why in a lot of ways Europe was at the forefront of all of that, and is still rich, because from a geographical point of view, on the reading list I've put Prisoners of Geography, which is an amazing book which you should read, it's called 10 Maps That Changed the World. So it's about physical locations of places and how that has an impact on their power. And although it's not like it's a journalist who wrote it, but I could have written, I don't know why I didn't. So he really talks about the fact that these physical factors have a lot to do with how powerful places are, and that idea of us having a temperate climate really helped the West, as it were, to innovate and come up with medical and other types of innovations. I'm thinking of the word mechanical kind of innovations to move out into the world and take over places. So that's the rise and fall of the British Empire, and that's how power changes over time. That's over quite a long amount of time. So what happens after the Second World War? We were all bankrupt. Europe was a terrible place. Lots and lots of places were destroyed because of the bombing, etc. And this is really where, I'm just flipping over my notes, this is really where we had the emergence of the US as the start of the major power. And we'd gone from that the British Empire and that other multipolar world now to all of those other kind of colonies crumbling and those empires crumbling, and the emergence of two main powers, and that was the US and the former the USSR, the United Soviet States of Russia, which we know as Russia now. So, why did the US emerge as so powerful then? Well, obviously they weren't involved too much in the war because they were quite far away. They had a bit of an involvement, a little bit. They'd like you to think a lot more if you see all the films. At the end, they did help quite a lot. So they came at the end, kind of, on their at the cavalry at the end, and they helped us out, Europe out. But actually what they did as well was, after the war ended and we all had to rebuild our economies and rebuild our cities and rebuild our infrastructure, rebuild our buildings, etc., and start buying things and get capitalism back on its feet, as it were, then the US really came into its own, because it had huge amounts of, it has a big population, it had lots of resources, as hopefully you've seen from the last lesson. And essentially it did something called the Marshall Plan. So it gave the European countries loans, essentially, to rebuild. And that was called the Marshall Plan. So it gave it aid and it gave them loans. So obviously it was going to get the money back, but it knew also that if it did that, then the European people would use the US market to buy their goods, etc. And that's what happened. So America really started to thrive then. And it started to manufacture all the goods that were brought over. It started to loan us money, etc., etc. So the US really becomes strong. And we know that the US has got a large population. It's got a big land area. It's got huge amounts of natural resources. It's from a climate point of view, most of it anyway, it's a temperate climate, etc. So it's doing really well. And we had crumbled, Europe had crumbled, who were the power. But now that power shifted again, and it shifted further west. And it shifted into the US. Now, to counterbalance that power in the West, we had the rather large giant of Russia, which, although Russia's got its issues, and in a minute I'm going to recommend where you get your information about the Cold War from in a sec, my videos. Russia, quite close to Europe, again, didn't get a huge amount of involvement in the war. It's massive, isn't it? You can't really invade Russia because it's mostly ice. But what it does have, it's got a huge landmass, it's got quite a large population, it's got huge amounts of natural resources, like huge amounts. And the first part of this I asked you to do was Mackinder's theory of power and location of power. And you'll see that Mackinder, I think that's how you say it, was saying that the heartland of power is always in the centre. So if you look at where Russia is in the centre, and it's got all of the landmass around it. Now, Mackinder thought that was going to be the seat of power because you had people around you. But what he didn't realise or take into account a lot was that there's not an awful lot of sea borders within Russia. There's a lot of landmass, but there's not a lot of there's not a lot of access to the coast. And in Prisoners of Geography, they talk a lot about the Russian incursion into Ukraine to get access to, the Black Sea and down into the Med and all that kind of thing. But I digress. So we have, at the end of the Second World War, we have this bipolar world emerging post-World War II, whereas in the West we've got the USA, and in the East we've got this massive giant of Russia. Huge amounts of land, gas, resources, etc., etc. And two opposing ideologies, really, which at the time were just starting out, I suppose. And within time, we saw which one worked, but, maybe which one's lost its holding in recent times. And that was capitalism versus communism. So if you do know about this, great. I found out with the past couple of years that you don't always know about this. I assume you do, but, you're only 17, so there's no reason why you would, in a way. But capitalism obviously is about free markets, and it's about being able to invest. It's about companies being free to invest and free to trade and that kind of thing. So that's what America's all about, the American dream, and the Americans being able to do what they want, and companies being able to make money, etc., etc. So that's capitalism, that's free market economy. Everybody is able to make money. And that is, you've got huge amounts of wealthy people, and people aren't doing so well. And in America, obviously, they don't have a national health service neither. So, it's even more extreme, I suppose, because you've got people who can't afford, national health service, I should say. And so, fall, below the net of what's the average earning, etc. So that, that really is a free market economy over. And although in America, but although we follow it, we obviously have more social things in place, like the National Health Service and unemployment benefit and housing benefit and that kind of thing. So we fall, we're a little bit short of that absolute free market economy. And then in the East, the Russians didn't agree with that kind of ideology, and they were mostly following Marxist theory. Now, those of you that do sociology will know a little bit more about this. I'm not a sociologist, but essentially, any of you that have read Animal Farm will understand that communism and socialism and Marxist theory is about equality. essentially. The bottom line is it's about equality. So communism, in theory, is about equality, and it's about the state controlling everything. So in the US, we know this because we've done globalization. The big TNCs and the big companies are owned privately. The government doesn't run it. Now, we've looked at that within the UK when we looked at the UK's open door policy and Thatcherism during the 80s, if you remember that, and how we started to sell off these big organisations that belong to the government. Well, in Russia, they didn't do that. The government kept control of all of those companies. So, you know, we've talked about British Gas and British Rail and British Telecom and British this and that. It would have been Russian this, Russian that. So the Russian government kept hold of those assets, as it were, and it tried to go down the route of communism and Marxism. And the ideology is that, I'm laughing because it obviously, you know, on paper it works, but it doesn't in reality. It's about the state controlling everything and being in charge of everything, but everybody being equal. Now, on paper, that's brilliant, but in reality, you know, the old adage that, you know, if you're a brain surgeon or a bin man, you're both doing a valid service, of course you are, but do you need to be paid the same? You know, a brain surgeon's going to have gone to university for 6, 8, 10 years, and a bin man isn't, and they're doing just as good a job, if you see me, moving our rubbish and making sure that we don't get disease, etc., but should they be paid the same? So the idea of communism, that kind of communism just doesn't work. So what Russia was left with, essentially, was the government, as in China, the government being in charge and the people not really having a say. So that is the reality of communism. And the Americans are really, really against that. So that is the start of what we call the Cold War. Now, I'm not going to go into the Cold War in this video because it would go on for hours, but what I would do, if you go onto my YouTube channel, which is JC Jog Support, and you'll almost right down at the bottom in the A-level section, you'll see 4 videos on the Cold War. I'd like you to watch those. Now, there's boards as well, so you can have a look at what it's the first videos that I did, so the boards are really rubbish, and I'm in my kitchen over there. But it took me a long time to make those videos, and there's a lot of information in them. So if you watch those videos on the Cold War, and it will talk about the way that the Russians and the Americans kind of started that, you know, battling against each other, really, and the reasons why it came to an end. So all I'm going to say is I'm going to skip to the end, and I'm going to say that that idea of communism, it went on for a few decades, and it got to 1989, 1990. And the Russians were in an absolute terrible state economically because America had been starting the global shift and outsourcing, you know, its stuff, and its TNCs were massive. It was making huge amounts of money, and it was privatising everything, and it was using cheap labour from abroad. And the Russians weren't doing that, and the communist Russian state fell apart, basically, which is why we've got places like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine. All of those places are now independent because, again, the USSR couldn't stay together because they didn't have the power, they didn't have the money and the power to keep those states together. So they started losing those states. They started letting them become independent because they couldn't keep them. So yeah, the USSR fell, and they realised that capitalism really was the way forward, and they couldn't carry on with communism. But however, you know, because most of the TNCs were American, America really wasn't that fussed about going into Russia and investing in Russia. So America went to China. And although China is communist, remember, it hadn't had that kind of falling out with Russia. And as we've talked about before, America wanted to kind of keep a foothold in Asia because it didn't want Russia spreading communism any further. So in the 70s and that, Mao Zedong actually opened up. We've done the Chinese open door policy, haven't we? So this is where these two, year topics merge, really. So we have the open door policy from the Chinese, which allowed TNC investment from the Americans to go in there. And then, Russia just fell. So again, that's another power shift. Do you see what I mean? So we had the multipolar world of the colonialism. Then that crumbled, and then we had a shift to the west and a bit to the east, and we had that bipolar, the Russians and the Americans, and we had that kind of bipolar world in terms of power and influence, and then that crumbled as well. So Russia fell off. And started to disseminate. And America really, over the last 20, 30 years, has become the unit power. That's what a unit power means, one power. And it's the most influential and the most powerful country. And it's called hegemony. Okay, so America is the hegemon. Now, those of you that do politics will know this word, hopefully. If you look it up as well, you can do a little bit of research on it if you want on the internet. But America was the hegemon. I'm going to say was because I think there's been a shift. After the Second World War and after the fall of communism in the late 80s, for the next 20 years or so, America was the hegemon. It had the economy, it had the TNCs, it had the population who were educated, it had the research and development into tech, it had the pharma companies, it had the culture, it had the TV, it had the music, it had everything. So it really was the hegemon. Europe, obviously, as a whole, is an interesting area, but individually, the countries just aren't as big and they just haven't got as much power. So there really wasn't for many decades a country to rival the US, because obviously the East, where, you know, China and the Eastern countries, that was the periphery. So if we think about our core periphery, Frank's model, the core was Europe and America, but Europe being a group of countries. And then the periphery was all those countries around, so South America and Asia and Africa, obviously, as well. So that was another shift, and the power shifted to the West, and it shifted to the US. Now, we would argue that in the last 10 years or so that America has lost its hegemony status, and we've had another shift. And we've had what I will call the re-emergence, not the emergence, but the re-emergence of China. And the reason I say re-emergence is that the Chinese had power many centuries ago with the dynasties and the Silk Roads, which again we'll talk about in another video. But they had that power. They were powerful. Those dynasties were powerful before the British Empire. So what I'm saying now is I'm saying the re-emergence of Asia and the re-emergence of China. So obviously that global shift into China allowed it to link and grow due to globalization and movement of that economy into China. Now, what started off with American companies moving to China, American TNCs, has shifted into Chinese and Asian TNCs becoming, you know, in the top 10 and in the top 50 economically, generating the most economically TNCs in the world. Getting a bit tongue-tied. Those TNCs now are Chinese TNCs that are driving, you know, the world economy, etc. That's what I want to say. So tech companies, Huawei, for example, you know, there's a big fuss about 5G now and a big fuss about Huawei taking harvesting all our information, etc. So they're bigger now, obviously, than they were before. So many would argue that, again, we're seeing right in front of us now this power shift. And we're seeing a movement of power and influence into the East, back into the East. And so you could argue we're becoming more multipolar because we've got the rise of India, the BRICS, Brazil, Mexico, India, China, Russia, to a certain extent, is still quite powerful in terms of it's got lots of oil and gas, obviously, because you do that within your other unit. Although from a soft power point of view, it really doesn't have much, really. So we've got that movement again. We've got the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative, which again you'll be looking at. You've got outsourcing. China's now outsourcing. China's investing in Africa. So we've got all the hallmarks of China becoming a core and having its own periphery. So we've got that movement again, that multipolar or even bipolar, but definitely bipolar, maybe multipolar shift again. So we've got another shift of power. Now, what's interesting, I'm just going to digress a little bit with all this stuff with COVID, is what I'm reading a lot of. I'm reading lots and lots about it at the moment. It's all a bit confusing, but I'm reading a lot about the fact that this may cause another shift in power, because at the moment, obviously, we've got all this manufacturing happening and a lot of unemployment, especially in the US, and Trump in power and him saying we're going to bring manufacturing back to the US. I'm going to bring, you know, greatness back to the US. Then suddenly there's a pandemic and it's come from China. And, you know, I'm thinking, will we stop trading with China? Will we shut our borders to China? Will this mean that China loses that power and that manufacturing comes back to us, which we need because now we need jobs, etc. So it opens up a massive can of worms to what is going to happen in the next decade, to that power shift that's happened. Because what is going to happen in China? Are we going to stop these links? Because COVID, if it did come from China, whether it come from a lab or not, there's all kinds of stories about at the moment, but ground zero was China. So are we going to allow those type of wet markets to continue and bring such devastation to people and the economy as we've seen in the last month, 2 months? So we need to watch this space and see what happens in terms of power. So that is the global shift there. So I think I've covered everything that I need to cover. Got a little bit overexcited there, but I do like this subject. So, like I said before, we've got this issue with COVID in China, but China's also got other issues. It's got a huge population, 1.3 billion. It's got 1 billion people living in poverty. Can a superpower really have 1 billion people living in poverty? I don't know. It's got a large ageing population because of the one-child policy. It's got a communist state who control the media, who control everything about the people. Can that be a superpower? So it puts into question all that we in the West would identify as being a superpower. But what we have to realise is that China and the East have, they're not interested in the West. I'm sure their kids at school are not learning about American superpowers. I'm sure they're not, because they've got 1.5 billion people and a large population around there to keep them occupied, etc. They've got a lack of soft power in China, because although Chinese is the most spoken language in the world with 1.3 billion, from a diffuse point of view, it's not the most diffuse language. Obviously, that's English. So we've got that is the power shift, basically. And all of this, hopefully, will help you in that 12 marker essay that we've got about explaining shift of power over time. Now, for that, you can use I've got itchy nose. You can use the colonialism. So I do a paragraph on colonialism and how we had the power and then lost it. Then I'd look at the emergence of the US and Russia, how that was a great power, then how Russia lost it. And I would look at the global shift to China and how it looks like, America's lost its status of being the hegemon, and China is now rising. But is China now going to fall again, and we're going to have another shift of power? So it's all very exciting, and might be in the next episode, I don't know. So hopefully this has run into half an hour, so I'm going to try and upload this. I might just keep it for you lot to have, and hopefully this will help. Please check out the 4 videos which are down at the bottom. Right at the bottom, there's just 4 of them, and that is the Cold War. I spent a lot of time doing those 4 videos. They're not that long, I don't think, but they're about maybe about 8 minutes each or something. So check that out. Any questions, email me. Otherwise, I hope you get on with this okay, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe.